really excited to have this opportunity with everybody here because world building is, as I said, my love language, and it's really awesome to connect with all of you and hear more about what it means for you to be world builders. So I think just to kick it off, what is world building to you? Dennis, I'll start with you.
World building is just essentially building the background of your story at its most basic, whether it's fantasy or a detective novel or science fiction or whatever. Your characters don't operate against a green screen. They operate against a backdrop of a real civilization, real worlds, real people, real conflicts, and you have to come up with those.
That's wonderful. Mark?
Yeah, I think gonna kind of go off a little bit.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Talking a lot about in our lives artificial intelligence, and what do we need for artificial intelligence, and then you kind of go to real intelligence. But ultimately, what you have, for any kind of intelligence is that you have this defined person or this defined thing, and then this person has to interact with the outside environment. And building the world that this thing is going to interact in, for me, is that is world building. For me, it's not so much fantasy as looking back. Since I write science fiction / historical fiction, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build a world that's historically accurate. And instead of kind of making this up in my head, what I'll do is I'll look to see what did exist, the kinds of people that were there in that environment, and then that's where I put my characters. And so for me, again, world building is kind of less my imagination and more looking back at the historical record and recreating an environment that was already there.
Fascinating. Rebecca?
So for me, because I am creating a star cluster and all these planets and all these worlds, I kind of think of world building as my transporter in order to bring the reader there. And that means the external environment of the planet, but it also means the culture of the planet and the race and its history and its norms, so that it's a fully fleshed out world, as well researched in my head as Mark does in making sure his historical fiction is historically accurate. You want that tapestry to be woven to the point where people believe the background instead of just having a sterile white room because you didn't come up with anything else.
Those are all fabulous questions or answers. I think kind of segueing into my next question would be, for your specific genre, what would you say was the most challenging aspect of world building? Dennis, we'll go right back to you.
Well, for the first published book, the Bobiverse, the most challenging thing for me was getting all the timelines straight, because I had a bunch of individuals flying around the galaxy, sublight speeds, so Einstein is a factor. And I had a problem occasionally with things being reacted to before they actually happened. So there was a lot of juggling to get things happening in the proper order.
I love that. I can relate. Mark?
I think I wanted my character to interact in a world that was historically accurate and not just the surroundings, say colonial Philadelphia. I wanted to make sure if he interacted with a particular person and talked with that person, that person was physically there on the historical record. And so it became a bit of a puzzle trying to figure out where. And Ben Franklin is a major player in the second novel. I had to make sure that he was in Philadelphia in that year. Thomas Jefferson, where was he? I had to make sure that he was in Virginia during that time, and so on and so on. And so kind of making his historically accurate and putting together that historical puzzle, and then have my character bounce off of it like, some kind of pool ball. That actually was very challenging, but then kind of very fulfilling once you kind of get it all together.
Oh, okay. Rebecca?
So for me, the biggest challenge is I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I used to be a paramedic, so I know some basic anatomy and physiology. So in my initial versions, which I wrote my first of these books when I was 15 and then promptly put it in a file drawer, you pull that out 10 years later and you realize you can't just say they're cat people, bird people, tree people. And so the wonderful thing about the science fiction community is there are so many scientists who are just dying to help you. And you can crowdsource and get feedback and beta readers and then work with artists. When I got to see my races actually designed, sketched by a Hugo nominated artist, it was so amazing. But they kept asking me questions I didn't know. Which way does this joint go? How does this interact? Where is the... And I had to learn so much more about the anatomy and physiology of my races, and it made for better writing.
Oh, that's going to be a question that's going to come up. Yeah, that's got my brain working. So kind of opposite of that, not just the most challenging, and Mark already hinted to this, but what was the most rewarding aspect to world building for you? Dennis, we'll go right back at you.
The thing about my writing career is that I read science fiction for somewhere between 50 and 60 years before I really started. And I was an absolute fan. I really read almost nothing else. So when I started writing science fiction, there was this huge surge of joy in actually producing a world that I had control of. And then when fans started to indicate that they liked the world, so much the better. There's nothing like being successful at something you really like doing.
I feel that. Mark?
I think it is, for me also, it was fan reactions, people who wrote specific things about being in the worlds. I've always been envious. When I was young, I was envious of authors and thinking, well, how did they inhabit my head? How did they create this image in my mind? And almost to the point of, is it real? It's a thought, but is it something that I've created that's a real thing? And then to actually get that reaction from people that I wrote something about, totally fulfilling. So I would say that.
I feel that. Yeah. Rebecca?
So I could talk about the external. I think they covered that. For me, it was the relief of the pressure of having these characters and the story taking up rental space in my head for decades. And they wanted to come out and play. And it would have driven me crazy had I not finally exercised them onto the page and gotten them out. And I think both Mark and Dennis will agree, there is nothing like when you are writing and the characters are just responding to the situation and each other, and you're just a conduit because they are so real in your head that they're talking to each other. You're just transcribing. And it feels like you, for a little while, are actually getting to live in that world you have created. And it's a nice escape. And it also feels good to not have that pressure in your head of trying to get it down, because then once you've got it down, you feel like you've accomplished something just getting it written. Now, rewriting, that's a whole other story.
Ooh, yeah. Rewriting edits, that's a whole different beast. But I agree with that. It's the characters start telling you the story and you are the conduit. And sometimes that means you're world building on the spot. And sometimes those are the most rewarding moments in the writing process, because you're like, wow, I would have never thought about that until the character just suddenly thought, I'm going to do it this way. And it worked. It's really exciting. Now let's
weird when sometimes the characters start doing things that you didn't expect in the middle of the scene.
Or I always say I'm a pantser because I try to do an outline and then things just go completely off the rails. So
yeah.
Yeah. And you're thinking to yourself, I've got this outline, I'm going to world build, I've got all these notes written. And sometimes the world building doesn't come to you until you're in that moment. And that's when you're doing the big stuff and you're going, well, it's going to be summers and it's not going to be years and it's going to be this kind of magic system. And it's all on the spot in one paragraph. And you're like, where did this just come from? And that's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to outlining, like Rebecca said, I've had trouble with that since the first book, and the story has just come out over time, and I keep wondering where it's coming from. But a lot of times, and I've told people this before, I'll start to write a chapter and not really know where those characters are supposed to be going, and then somehow, over the course of however long it takes, you're like, okay, this is the story that's supposed to be told. And I don't know where it comes from.
But if you know your character really well and you know the situation really well, you put them in a room and shit happens. Stuff happens.
That's what I mean. And
there's YouTube for you. Like that one.
Oh, that was good. So how does everybody feel about the world building on the spot? Would you all unanimously agree that that's something that's very common for you, and the whole outline pre-world building thing is more difficult, or is it easier to world build on the spot? How do you all feel about that?
Well, outlining is definitely necessary. At least for me. I mean, I've talked to some authors who just say they just sit down at the keyboard and start writing, and I can't even begin to visualize that. But I write an outline. I have a beginning. I have an end. Sometimes I have a bit of a middle, and then I start writing, and it goes out the window completely.
Would you say that impacts your world building at all?
Yeah, the thing about my world building is a lot of times I am writing, as has been mentioned before, I'm writing the world building as I go, and sometimes something that I add affects something I've already written. So it becomes an iterative process. You have to go back and change things to account for the fact that this is how things work. By the time you're finished, you can have this really detailed, really consistent, really complex world, and people can say, wow, how can you think all that up, right off the cuff? And you don't.
Nope.
It's the result of a lot of editing.
Oh, yeah.
It reminds me, I think I read somewhere where Michelangelo, the statue of David, he said that I had this big block of marble and David was already there. I just had to get rid of the marble around to show him. And I keep wondering if that's what you're saying, Dennis, is there's a story there and you're kind of keep chiseling away at it. And the beginning, the end, the middle, and eventually you have this sculpture, but it takes a while to kind of uncover it. Yeah. So cool.
To extend the metaphor, though, you're working to uncover this sculpture, but you don't know when you start exactly what he's going to look like or what position he's going to be in.
Right.
Well, and for me, I started my world building backwards. So I would need a character. I should say I would meet a character, and that character would remind me more of one particular animal. And then I would turn that into an evolved species. Ooh. And then I would go, okay, well, what does that species look like? The anatomy, physiology, what's their personality, what's their character, what's their history? And then from that, I would work with scientist friends to figure out what kind of planet they would have evolved on. And then just from this one character, now I've got a race, I've got a world, but I've also ended up with an encyclopedia like this thick before I put it, just onto the computer, because it's hard to keep track of it all. So trying to keep consistency, like Dennis said, sometimes something you do over here means you've got to go back and fix it over here. And I'm really glad that I had zero drafted. That's what I call pantsing. Not quite an outline, but not quite a first draft. I did a zero draft of the first 3 books because I wouldn't have realized some of the stuff in book 1 that totally affected book 3 that totally affected book 1, and vice versa, stuff in book 1 that affected book 3. So I had to know some of the stuff that was coming to make sure it was consistent in the first book. So, yeah.
Oh, that's a beast. I get that. Let's bring it back down to basics. Let's just have a little fun here. We're all readers, right? Oh, yeah. So what would you say was a book that for all of you, for each one of you, really impacted your influence as a storyteller, that stands with you and goes, that is such an incredible world, that inspired me? What is it?
Well, for me, the book that inspired me the most is The Martian by Andy Weir.
Ooh.
And it's a direct inspiration in that I read that book. I found out about the backstory, where he had basically been writing the book on, was it Reddit? I can't remember.
A blog of some kind.
And getting feedback and stuff. So this guy is not a professional. Well, he wasn't at the time. He is now a professional writer. And he managed to get a book published. And it was like a light bulb going off. You don't have to take university courses to be a writer.
No.
You don't have to, sweat in a back room for 20 years before you can publish your first book. And hey, I can do that. Well, maybe I can do that. I'm not sure I can do that, but I can try to do that. And turned out I can.
I love that answer. I think that's important for everybody. You don't have to go to school to be a writer. That's absolutely.
Just be careful, though, Dennis. You're making it sound way easier than that.
I know.
I considered myself an educated person when I started writing, and I started very late. And I wrote a lot of scientific articles, and I would say it took me 5 years to learn how to really write, working with an editor, to do it well. And I would have thought, and so I don't know. I think you're not giving yourself enough credit for your talents and the work that you put in. And I always kind of warn writers, I'm like, look, 5 to 10 years to be good at this skill.
Yeah.
And you better sit down. You better learn how to do it. So, but that's just me. Maybe it was tough. So a lot of work.
I think in my case, it was the 50 plus years of reading science fiction before I started.
See? Right.
Just like an expert system absorbs specific data before outputting results, I absorbed 50 years worth of science fiction before trying to put something on paper myself. And I'm sure you can find the ghosts of a lot of the authors that I used to read in my writing.
Yeah, that's an education right there. That is definitely something. For me, you asked specifically who I thought the world building just had blown me away. And it would be, since I'm a YA science fiction writer, Tamara Pierce. Between her Wild Magic, Becca Cooper, her other books that all still take place on Toradol, she has developed a world that, even though it's fantasy, is so consistent in the rules and has built up such beautiful layering of history and culture. And it's not totally homogenous. The people in this one area have something different than the people over here. And she does an amazing job of transporting you to this other place. And she does it through the very close perspective of the character. And so you get to see that world through that character's eyes, and you learn as much about the character by what she sees and how it affects her as you do the world. And it is an amazing journey that you're taking on with a character you are happy to do the journey with.
Right.
And I learned an important lesson that way.
Ooh, that's going to segue into my next question, I think. And I think to some degree, I think we can all agree. Is there a form of symbolism in your world building? Do you like big thematic themes or like symbolism with the world or anything like that you put into creating these worlds that you explore?
So I'm going to say for me, I've explored. I'm a scientist, and I have worked as a scientist for a long time and been part of that environment. And one of my goals has always to be to explain God to scientists, because even as a young man, I've always believed in a higher power. And so part of the underlying theme of my books has been a scientist rationalizing the existence of God, and then how it's intertwined with the quantum world and human consciousness and the universe, and trying to come up with one universal theory of how it is an evolution. And for me, it's all combined. And I've used my book, and the underlying theme of it has been that rationalize the existence of God to a scientist.
Wow. That's a beast of a theme to take on in your work. That's impressive. Dennis, do you want to jump off that?
Yeah, my books don't have layers in that way. I don't have symbolism. I don't do symbolism. I'm very much a literalist. But in terms of themes, I tend to write intelligent, rational people who make intelligent, rational decisions. And I hate idiot scripts. I love the Geico commercial where they're trying to run away from all the chainsaw massacres and stuff like that, and they keep doing dumb things.
Oh my goodness!
That's my theme commercial, I guess. In terms of, don't do this. But yeah, I try to make my characters' reactions believable. I try to make things flow logically, and that's I guess my symbolism.
Yeah.
So I almost hate to admit it because I'm giving something away, but in my writing, each of the different races actually represent a different aspect of human nature.
Oh.
So
okay.
You're really examining the intellectual aspects through the Phlegoans, who are like Ents. You are basically exploring the libido and the high energy, type of very overtly sexual in the Centagles. You're exploring the almost Klingon side of human nature and the Berserkers and the Katians. And so it's kind of fun to tear a human being apart and then amplify that side and go, well, what would a race like be if they were more this aspect of a human? And then my protagonist, who is a hybrid human, gets to deal with all these different races and those different parts of herself, since she's a hybrid of all of them.
Oh.
And so, yeah. And so that's the symbolism there, is looking at human nature by hiding it in the guise of different aliens. But Gene Roddenberry did that with Star Trek way back when. So it's not exactly pioneering, but it was fun.
But I think it's so fun to hear just the different takes on world building, the literalist versus the symbolism, the rational versus anything is possible, magic exists and we're going to, ethereal float out, all that fun stuff. And I think anybody watching this and anybody tuning in, or upcoming storytellers that are really trying to discover their voice and want to world build, can take something from that and go, okay, I don't have to fit in this box. I think the biggest lesson I learned as a world builder and a storyteller myself was just the fact of stepping outside that box and saying, anything is possible if I make it possible. The only person making rules is me. So.
And I'd like to ask a question of the panelists, if you don't mind.
Let's do it.
Because one of the reasons I find world building so satisfying is because we have so little control over the real world and what happens in our life to us. Now, we can control how we react to it. But when we're writing and we're world building, we have absolute control of what happens. So I'd like to hear from you guys. What is that feeling like, and how do you find it? You brought up God before. How do you find it getting to play God in fiction?
Well, there is a danger of writing a Mary Sue or Gary Stu story if you have all the control and not enough tendency to put in conflict. But in my case, I'm an optimist, so I tend to write ultimately optimistic futures. There's a lot of pessimism in there. I mean, at one point, the human race gets killed down to 15 million people, so that you can't really call that optimism. But they do rebound, so that's something. And my worlds tend towards post-scarcity because I think that is something that's going to happen. But there's still a lot of room for conflict. There has to be, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think my biggest challenge has been people don't want to read about people that have their characters that have their lives all sorted out. They don't.
Oh,
no way.
Somebody to have the ultimate power. But, I started out writing, the lead character in my book is a 26-year-old scientist named Matt Miller. And I started writing him really as an antidote to the anti-heroes that we are obsessed with in society, like Tony Soprano, Walter White, even Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones, right? These anti-heroes. And I wanted a real hero. Okay. And so then the challenge becomes with a real hero that, your son could look up to. You still have to make him interesting. You still have to put some flaws in there. And then it becomes challenging. What kind of flaws are okay for a normal type of hero?
Yeah.
A person who you can say, yeah, I want to be like this person, or I want my son to be like this person. So you walk that thin line. You can't make them all powerful. They have to have some weaknesses, but then picking the weakness, that's the challenge.
No, you have to remember, you're the author. You're all powerful. Your characters are not.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
Though. How strong of a hero are you going to make him? And he better not be too strong, or he's not going to be interesting, right? He better, be right on the edge of failing.
Relatable.
Yes.
I love that. Solid question, Rebecca. I always like to say writers are creators and destroyers of worlds. And like it's been mentioned, that can be extremely dangerous, but also really fulfilling. Sorry,
I'm just going to say, because you said that my tagline on some of my forum handles is destroying worlds since 2015.
I love that.
That's pretty
T-shirts.
good.
That's a T-shirt idea right there, Dennis. You need to make that and sell that. Would you say, and it was kind of mentioned prior, Rebecca was hinting at it, and it's going to be kind of two questions. Would you say that the editing process is where the magic happens for the world building, or would you say it all happens in that first draft? Ooh.
Oh, I'll take that one then.
Let's do it.
The world building definitely happens in the first draft, in my opinion. That's where the basic structure is created. My editor is a really, really good editor, but he doesn't, generally speaking, try to change fundamental structural issues. It's more, it's the obvious line editing stuff, but also consistency and timelines and stuff like that, because I tend to get a little loose with my timelines sometimes. But yeah, by the time it goes to the editor, the world should be built.
Okay. All right. I respect that. And I could learn a lesson or two from you, Dennis. Mark?
I don't know. Back in the day when I was running screenplays around LA, their mantra was always there's no good writing, there's only good rewriting. There's a point to that, right?
Yes.
I do start to enjoy the rewriting a lot more than the writing, because I think maybe it takes less mental energy For me, as I said, it's for my characters, it's bouncing a ball around the pool table and careening off of things. And I still have to, as I bounce, and I bounce the wrong way because I got something wrong, I have to fix it. Right, and kind of make sure it's as accurate as possible. So, the challenging part for me is the rewriting for that. But really, all the thought comes in with the whole original sitting down and I would say the butt glue, sitting down in the seat,
Yes.
and
Yes.
putting that first draft down is hard. It is hard for me anyway. So.
Oh.
So for me, I wear two different hats. I mean, I'm a writer and I'm a freelance editor. And as a writer, the zero draft for me is just the clay, and it's really fun to make. And I get all dirty and I'm squishing it and twisting it and I'm playing with it because my zero draft is maybe 120 pages of what's going to be a 300-page book.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't invested enough that I can't change it. On the first real draft, then I'm asking myself, okay, well, what if this, or why that? And it's more developing further that scaffolding, almost as if it is a framework. And then on the second draft, then I'm adding in the finite details. Now, as an editor, when I get a book, I often find that the biggest problem that people have with their world building, and I specialize in science fiction as an editor, is that they do one of two things. They have the generic white room because they didn't want to figure out what the heck the room would look like, or they spend 2 pages telling the reader what the room looks like instead of working in details to the actions and the scene. And so it's a matter of go ahead and just take the time to tell yourself what the setting and the scene looks like. And then in one of the drafts, pepper and work that in, and always ask yourself why and what if. And that way it becomes more layered and not flat. And so I think all parts of the process are important. And I think they all add different things, fleshing it out.
Love that. Dennis, were you going to admit to something? Confessions?
Not admit to it so much. On the subject of world building and exposition, we, as a society and as readers, we're a lot more intolerant of a whole lot of exposition than we used to be. There's a book that I read as a young'un called Recall Not Earth by C.C. McCapp, and really one of my favorite books of all time. But the author spends one entire chapter, 8 pages, small print, expounding on their universe structure, how FTL works, how their anti-gravity works, how the weapons work. I mean, it's like one of Larry Niven's articles that he writes occasionally, but those are intended to be nonfiction, or at least be nonfiction. This was just plunked right into the middle of the book. And in those days, you could get away with it because people loved it, or at least geeks like me loved it anyway. But you can't do that anymore.
Info dump.
I find only about 1/10 of what I have created ends up explicitly on the page, but that other percentage affects everything else going on, so it feels authentic.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. It's that fine line of, do I add too much information here, or do I introduce it 2 pages later? And it's a dance. It really is. But that's exciting. That's the editing process and all that, the remastering and the rewriting, as Mark mentioned. That's where the magic happens for me. But let's get down to confessions. I want to hear, as world builders, do you have a detailed collection binder or Word document, Excel sheet, tracking all your world building details? Or are you somebody that kind of has it and, recalls half of it in your head when you're writing? Or do you just go off memory? Like, let's get down and dirty.
Well, in my case, I don't maintain anything after the fact. But when I was writing the Bobiverse series in the first place, I had a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, for maintaining my timeline integrity. I mean, I had to write a spreadsheet because things were getting out of control. And I wrote a couple of apps to do things like calculate time dilation and stuff like that, and the amount of time it would take to go between stars, because
Wow.
I'm a nutter for details. But after the fact, if I need to remember just how long it takes to get to Epsilon Eridani from Omicron to Eridani, I have to go back to book 2 and look it up.
Yes, I feel that. Mark?
Well, I have an extensive collection of historical books, so autobiographies, anything that's relevant to the characters that are in the historical part of my book. And then the other thing that I've had to do, since mine takes place in colonial times, and this is the world that I'm building, I had to get the language right.
Ooh.
And it took me quite a long time to collect, different terms that colonial people would use. I'm not upset, I'm vexed. Okay, he's not my friend, he's my fellow. Like they wouldn't say darn, they would say zounds. That was a colonial saying. Or he's not crazy, he's off the hooks, stuff like that. And so what I've done over the years really is like just taken, and what I'll spew the words down on spewing. That's a good word, right? I'll spew them down on the page, and I'll have pages and pages written, and then I'll say, okay, where did I say something? Oh, okay, that's another one. Okay didn't exist until like the 1870s, maybe. People didn't say okay. We use okay for everything, in sort of our 21st century vernacular. So I do have a big file that has a lot of that, and what I'll do is I'll just replace, wherever I use the 20th century or 21st century word, and I'll replace it with an 18th century.
So I take it completely differently. I have 2 binders that are this thick that have my races, places, language, characters, histories of each world. And now, of course, it's all on my computer. But that doesn't, even though I'm an editor, I have an editor do my book. It's just like being a lawyer. You'd be an idiot to hire yourself. So that doesn't do an editor or a proofreader, more especially, any good when they're looking for consistencies. And I have so many terms and planets and names. So I create a style sheet that the proofreader gets to. Yeah, and it just makes their job easier, and it makes sure that your book doesn't have errors in it that can be avoided. And let me tell you, readers will come back and they will spot things.
Yes, they will.
Yeah, I as I mentioned at the beginning, I do audio books, or my novels become audiobooks first. And the narrator, Ray Porter, who's, by the way, an excellent narrator and has a lot of followers, because I didn't provide style sheets or notes or anything like that for my second novel in the Quantum Earth series. One of the characters had an Indian accent in book 1, but did not have the Indian accent in book 2. But I mean, Ray can't be expected to remember. That was my responsibility, and I dropped the ball on that one. So, and the readers noticed. The readers noticed. I've taken a lot of flack about that.
It is ruthless. I understand that part. It's the small details that slip by sometimes. Rebecca, you are the spirit woman that we all need to embody sometimes, with the detail that you collect and have with your world. I like to say I'm a mix between Mark and Dennis, where I'm referring back to page 20 on the first book for that eye color from that one character even though I totally should have written it down. But then on top of that, I also have the big events labeled with the historical events, and because you have to track that history when you're working with those big worlds. Yeah.
Now, what some of my clients use, apparently Scribner makes it a
I've
lot
heard of it.
easier to keep track of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
I haven't learned to work that way, and I have so many clients that it's just Word is what everybody uses. But I've been tempted to try it.
Mm-hmm. And it's breaking out of your habits. For me, I'm a big pen and paper person when it comes to world building, but when it comes to the writing process, give me a Word document and I'm the happiest person, and I'll write anything you need me to do. But yeah, there's a lot of upcoming storytellers and established storytellers that I've heard using these apps that are able to track massive worlds in detail. All you need is a password to get in and everything's there for you. And definitely.
But that can be distracting too.
True.
Sometimes you just want to be able to put a note, find out how long of a flight it is to this planet, move on, and those brackets and first drafts save my flow so many times when I don't want to stop the process to world build on the spot. The scene and the characters is more important at that moment.
Oh yeah. That's so true. It's what works best for you. I know we are coming up on that time. And one thing I really, really, really want to ask, because I know there's so many upcoming storytellers out there, and I've had such the pleasure to meet a number of them and help them in multiple or whatever capacity they need me to. And I'm sure you three have as well, is what would you say as an upcoming storyteller? What would be the biggest piece of advice for world building and storytelling to that new budding writer that's like, how do I figure myself out? How do I do this?
Make the world building consistent, because the readers will catch it.
This is true. Notes, detail, write it down.
Or have a memory.
Oh yeah. Or have the memory of an elephant, which I have taken advantage of that, and it has bit me in the butt on countless occasions in edits with my editor. He's like, wasn't this supposed to be? And I'm like, yeah, you were right. You're right. I thought I had it together. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I don't know specifically if it's world building, but I will say I'll go back to Hemingway, and he said, "Finish what you start.
Well,
Don't leave unfinished things. So if you start writing, finish it. We have a habit of starting and going, it's not so good. Finish it." And then kind of connected with that. And every writer that I've read who's ever mentioned this has talked about writer's block. And they've all said the same thing. Sit down and write. Have a time where you sit down and write, whether there's inspiration or not. And when you come back a few days later, you won't know the difference between that day when you were madly inspired, that comes maybe once a month, and those days where you sat yourself down and you did the work. Okay, so those two things. Don't wait for inspiration. Finish what you start.
I love that.
So for me, specifically for people who want to write science fiction, it's instead of trying to come up with stuff that is just completely out of your imagination. There is so much strange. There's so much absolutely bizarre life here on Earth that you can get inspiration right here by looking at all the strange creatures, all the strange life forms. And in George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, he based on a specific period of time, and he used that as the foundation. If you have a foundation, then you can fictionalize it a lot better. That would be my point.
I love that. Dennis?
Yeah, I agree with that. My baddies in the Bobiverse, the others, were based on the blue glaucus, which is just a little marine animal. But I looked at that and I said, aha, bad guys.
I love that. It's so important. Keep writing. keep writing, detail, make those notes, and look around you. There's inspiration everywhere. You walk outside, take a walk down your road or trail, or if you live in the mountains, go on a hike. You can find inspiration anywhere to create the biggest world on the planet. So I love that. And I think anybody listening to this can take something away from each one of us and say, oh, okay, maybe I'm overthinking it, or maybe I'm, I don't believe enough in myself. And it's like, no, sit down, trust the process, and just write. It's going to come together, I promise. But now I know we are at the time, and I definitely don't want us to get cut off or anything like that. So I'm just really excited that we had this opportunity and that we all got to meet together and talk. We're storytellers and world builders from all sorts of different genres and backgrounds, and we have such amazing perspectives of world building that it shows that anything is possible and that there's no rules to the writing process except an editor. Please do an editor. I think we can all agree to that.
Yep.
But yeah, so thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate this.
So if anybody is interested, they can contact me through my website, and I will send them the race and planet building worksheets that I use. I'm always willing to send those out to any aspiring authors that would help them get their world building going.
Oh, I love that. And I'd love to keep in contact with you three as well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I do want to plug the books, right? So my
Let's plug.
book it was out 2 days ago, Architect. So please read the Matt Miller and the Colonies series. They're available to order from my website, markjroseauthor.com. You can also get them on Amazon and also Audible.
Love that. Dennis, let's do it.
I am currently working on the 5th book of the Bobiverse. I am in editing hell at the moment. That's the background. But I don't have anything specific to plug right now. My last book, Earthside, just came out in audiobook, and it'll be out in text form in another 2-3 months.
Ooh, I love it. And Rebecca, tell me a little bit more give us a good plug. I know you mentioned a little bit about the editing and world building help, but what about your work? Let's plug that.
All right. So the first book in my Praxis Star Cluster series is just out. It is Escaping the Dashia, and it is the one that launches the story of Twyla ending up back in the Praxis Star Cluster where everything goes wrong very quickly.
We wouldn't want it any other way, to be honest. And final plug for me is I just released the second book to the Varelian Saga yesterday, so super excited about that. It's an epic high fantasy with a dark twist. It's a 9-book saga, and you can see more about it on my website at thevareliansaga.com, and you can find my socials that way and contact me that way too if any budding storyteller needs my help or wants to just have an ear to listen to.